13. Miracles. First published in The Guardian, 2nd of October 1942, the text was expanded and preached as a sermon in St. Jude on the Hill Church, London, subsequently appearing in St. Jude's Gazette, No. 73, October 1942. It was later published in Undeceptions, 1971, and is now in God in the Dock, 1998. I have known only one person in my life who claimed to have seen a ghost. It was a woman, and the interesting thing is that she disbelieved in the immortality of the soul before seeing the ghost, and still disbelieves after having seen it. She thinks it was a hallucination. In other words, seeing is not believing. This is the first thing to get clear in talking about miracles. Whatever experiences we may have, we shall not regard them as miraculous if we already hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural. Any event which is claimed as a miracle is, in the last resort, an experience received from the senses, and the senses are not infallible. We can always say we have been the victims of an illusion. If we disbelieve in the supernatural, this is what we always shall say. Hence, whether miracles have really ceased or not, they would certainly appear to cease in Western Europe as materialism became the popular creed. For let us make no mistake, if the end of the world appeared in all the literal trappings of the apocalypse, the modern materialist saw with his own eyes the heavens rolled up, Revelation chapter 6, verse 14, and the great white throne appearing, chapter 20, verse 11. If he had the sensation of being himself hurled into the lake of fire, chapter 19, verse 20, chapter 20, verses 10, 14, and 15, chapter 21, verse 8. He would continue forever in that lake itself, to regard his experience as an illusion, and to find the explanation of it in psychoanalysis or cerebral pathology. Experience by itself proves nothing. If a man doubts whether he is dreaming or waking, no experiment can solve his doubt, since every experiment may itself be part of the dream. Experience proves this or that or nothing according to the preconceptions we bring to it. This fact, that the interpretation of experience depends on preconceptions, is often used as an argument against miracles. It is said that our ancestors, taking the supernatural for granted and greedy of wonders, read the miraculous into events that were really not miracles. And in a sense I grant it. That is to say, I think that just as our preconceptions would prevent us from apprehending miracles if they really occurred, so their preconceptions would lead them to imagine miracles even if they did not occur. In the same way, the doting man will think his wife faithful when she is not, and the suspicious man will not think her faithful when she is. The question of her actual fidelity remains meanwhile to be settled, if at all, on other grounds. But there is one thing often said about our ancestors which we must not say. We must not say, they believed in miracles because they did not know the laws of nature. This is nonsense. When St. Joseph discovered that his bride was pregnant, he was minded to put her away. Matthew chapter 1, verse 19. He knew enough biology for that. Otherwise, of course, he would not have regarded pregnancy as a proof of infidelity. When he accepted the Christian explanation, he regarded it as a miracle precisely because he knew enough of the laws of nature to know that this was a suspension of them. When the disciples saw Christ walking on the water, Matthew chapter 14, verse 26, Mark chapter 6, verse 49, John chapter 6, verse 19, they were frightened. They would not have been frightened unless they had known the laws of nature and known that this was an exception. If a man had no conception of a regular order in nature, then of course he could not notice departures from that order. Just as a dunce who does not understand the normal metre of a poem is also unconscious of the poet's variations from it. Nothing is wonderful except the abnormal, and nothing is abnormal until we have grasped the norm. Complete ignorance of the laws of nature would preclude the perception of the miraculous just as rigidly as complete disbelief in the supernatural precludes it, perhaps even more so. For while the materialist would have at least to explain miracles away, the man wholly ignorant of nature would simply not notice them. The experience of a miracle, in fact, requires two conditions. First, we must believe in a normal stability of nature, which means we must recognize that the data offered by our senses recur in regular patterns. Secondly, we must believe in some reality beyond nature. When both beliefs are held, and not till then, we can approach with an open mind the various reports which claim that this super or extra-natural reality has sometimes invaded and disturbed the sensuous content of space and time which makes our natural world. The belief in such a supernatural reality itself can neither be proved nor disproved by experience. The arguments for its existence are metaphysical and to me conclusive. They turn on the fact that even to think and act in the natural world, we have to assume something beyond it, and even assume that we partly belong to that something. In order to think, we must claim for our own reasoning a validity which is not credible if our thought is merely a function of our brain, and our brains a byproduct of irrational physical processes. In order to act above the level of mere impulse, we must claim a similar validity for our judgments of good and evil. In both cases, we get the same disquieting result. The concept of nature itself is one we have reached only tacitly by claiming a sort of supernatural status for ourselves. If we frankly accept this position and then turn to the evidence, we find, of course, that accounts of the supernatural meet us on every side. History is full of them, often in the same documents which we accept wherever they do not report miracles. Respectable missionaries report them not infrequently. The whole Church of Rome claims their continued occurrence. Intimate conversation elicits from almost every acquaintance at least one episode in his life which is what he would call queer or rum. No doubt most stories of miracles are unreliable, but then, as anyone can see by reading the papers, so are most stories of all events. Each story must be taken on its merits. What one must not do is to rule out the supernatural as the one impossible explanation. Thus you may disbelieve in the Mons angels because you cannot find a sufficient number of sensible people who say they saw them. But if you found a sufficient number, it would, in my view, be unreasonable to explain this by collective hallucination. For we know enough of psychology to know that spontaneous unanimity in hallucination is very improbable. And we do not know enough of the supernatural to know that a manifestation of angels is equally improbable. The supernatural theory is the less improbable of the two. When the Old Testament says that Sennacherib's invasion was stopped by angels, 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 35, and Herodotus says it was stopped by a lot of mice who came and ate up all the bowstrings of his army, an open-minded man will be on the side of the angels. Unless you start by begging the question, there is nothing intrinsically unlikely in the existence of angels, or in the action ascribed to them. But mice just don't do these things. A great deal of skepticism now current about the miracles of our Lord does not, however, come from disbelief of all reality beyond nature. It comes from two ideas which are respectable but I think mistaken. In the first place, modern people have an almost aesthetic dislike of miracles. Admitting that God can, they doubt if he would. To violate the laws he himself has imposed on his creation seems to them arbitrary, clumsy, a theatrical device only fit to impress savages, a solecism against the grammar of the universe. In the second place, many people confuse the laws of nature with the laws of thought, and imagine that their reversal or suspension would be a contradiction in terms, as if the resurrection of the dead were the same sort of thing as 2 and 2 making 5. I have only recently found the answer to the first objection. I found it first in George MacDonald, and later in St. Athanasius. This is what St. Athanasius says in his little book on the Incarnation. Our Lord took a body like ours and lived as a man, in order that those who had refused to recognize him in his superintendence and captaincy of the whole universe might come to recognize from the works he did here below in the body that what dwelled in this body was the Word of God. This accords exactly with Christ's own account of his miracles. The Son can do nothing of himself but what he seeth the Father do. John chapter 5 verse 19. The doctrine, as I understand it, is something like this. There is an activity of God displayed throughout creation, a wholesale activity, let us say, which men refuse to recognize. The miracles done by God incarnate, living as a man in Palestine, perform the very same things as this wholesale activity, but at a different speed and on a smaller scale. One of their chief purposes is that men, having seen a thing done by personal power on the small scale, may recognize, when they see the same thing done on the large scale, that the power behind it is also personal, is indeed the very same person who lived among us 2,000 years ago. The miracles, in fact, are a retelling in small letters of the very same story which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. Of that larger script, part is already visible, part is still unsolved. In other words, some of the miracles do locally what God has already done universally. Others do locally what he has not yet done but will do. In that sense, and from our human point of view, some are reminders and others prophecies. God creates the vine, and teaches it to draw up water by its roots, and, with the aid of the sun, to turn that water into a juice which will ferment and take on certain qualities. Thus, every year, from Noah's time till ours, God turns water into wine. That men fail to see. Either, like the pagans, they refer the process to some finite spirit, Bacchus or Dionysus, or else, like the moderns, they attribute real and ultimate causality to the chemical and other material phenomena which are all that our senses can discover in it. But when Christ at Cana makes water into wine, the mask is off. John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. The miracle has only half its effect if it only convinces us that Christ is God. It will have its full effect if, whenever we see a vineyard or drink a glass of wine, we remember that here works he who sat at the wedding party in Cana. Every year God makes a little corn into much corn. The seed is sown, and there is an increase, and men, according to the fashion of their age, say, "It is Ceres, it is Adonis, it is the corn king," or else, "It is the laws of nature." The close-up, the translation of this annual wonder, is the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew chapter 14, verses 15 to 21, Mark chapter 6, verses 34 to 44, Luke chapter 9, verses 12 to 17, John chapter 6, verses 1 to 11. Bread is not made there of nothing. Bread is not made of stones, as the devil once suggested to our Lord in vain. Matthew chapter 4, verse 3, Luke chapter 4, verse 3. A little bread is made into much bread. The Son will do nothing but what he sees the Father do. There is, so to speak, a family style. The miracles of healing fall into the same pattern. This is sometimes obscured for us by the somewhat magical view we tend to take of ordinary medicine. The doctors themselves do not take this view. The magic is not in the medicine, but in the patient's body. What the doctor does is to stimulate nature's functions in the body, or to remove hindrances. In a sense, though we speak for convenience of healing a cut, every cut heals itself. No dressing will make skin grow over a cut on a corpse. That same mysterious energy which we call gravitational when it steers the planets, and biochemical when it heals a body, is the efficient cause of all recoveries. And if God exists, that energy, directly or indirectly, is his. All who are cured by him, the healer within. But once he did it visibly, a man meeting a man. Where he does not work within in this mode, the organism dies. Hence, Christ's one miracle of destruction is also in harmony with God's wholesale activity. His bodily hand, held out in symbolic wrath, blasted a single fig tree. Matthew chapter 21, verse 19, Mark chapter 11, verses 13 to 20. But no tree died that year in Palestine, or any year, or in any land, or even ever will, save because he has done something, or, more likely, ceased to do something to it. When he fed the thousands, he multiplied fish as well as bread. Look in every bay and almost every river. This swarming, pulsating fecundity shows he is still at work. The ancients had a god called Genius, the god of animal and human fertility. the presiding spirit of gynecology, embryology, or the marriage bed, the genial bed, as they called it after its god Genius. As the miracles of wine and bread and healing showed who Bacchus really was, who Ceres, who Apollo, and that all were one, so this miraculous multiplication of fish reveals the real genius. And with that we stand at the threshold of the miracle which, for some reason, most offends modern ears. I can understand the man who denies the miraculous altogether. But what does one make of the people who admit some miracles but deny the virgin birth? Is it that for all their lip service to the laws of nature, there is only one law of nature that they really believe? Or is it that they see in this miracle a slur upon sexual intercourse, which is rapidly becoming the one thing venerated in a world without veneration? No miracle is, in fact, more significant. What happens in ordinary generation? What is a father's function in the act of begetting? A microscopic particle of matter from his body fertilizes the female. And with that microscopic particle passes, it may be, the colour of his hair, and his great-grandfather's hanging lip, and the human form in all its complexity of bones, liver, sinews, heart, and limbs, and pre-human form which the embryo will recapitulate in the womb. Behind every spermatozoon lies the whole history of the universe. Locked within it is no small part of the world's future. That is God's normal way of making a man, a process that takes centuries, beginning with the creation of matter itself, and narrowing to 1 second and 1 particle at the moment of begetting. And once again, men will mistake the sense impressions which this creative act throws off for the act itself, or else refer it to some finite being such as genius. Once, therefore, God does it directly, instantaneously, without a spermatozoon, without the millenniums of organic history behind the spermatozoon. There was, of course, another reason. This time he was creating not simply a man, but the man who was to be himself, the only true man. The process which leads to the spermatozoon has carried down with it through the centuries much undesirable silt. The life which reaches us by that normal route is tainted. To avoid that taint, to give humanity a fresh start, he once short-circuited the process. There is a vulgar anti-God paper which some anonymous donor sends me every week. In it recently I saw the taunt that we Christians believe in a God who committed adultery with the wife of a Jewish carpenter. The answer to that is that if you describe the action of God in fertilizing Mary as adultery, then, in that sense, God would have committed adultery with every woman who ever had a baby. For what he did once without a human father, he does always, even when he uses a human father as his instrument. For the human father in ordinary generation is only a carrier, sometimes an unwilling carrier, always the last in a long line of carriers of life that comes from the supreme life. Thus the filth that our poor, muddled, sincere, resentful enemies fling at the Holy One either does not stick, or, sticking, turns into glory. So much for the miracles which do, small and quick, what we have already seen in the large letters of God's universal activity. But before I go on to the second class, those which foreshadow parts of the universal activity we have not yet seen, I must guard against a misunderstanding. Do not imagine I am trying to make the miracles less miraculous. I am not arguing that they are more probable because they are less unlike natural events. I am trying to answer those who think them arbitrary, theatrical, unworthy of God, meaningless interruptions of universal order. They remain, in my view, wholly miraculous. To do instantly with dead and baked corn what ordinarily happens slowly with live seed is just as great a miracle as to make bread of stones. Just as great, but a different kind of miracle. That is the point. When I open Ovid or Grimm, I find the sort of miracles which really would be arbitrary. Trees talk, houses turn into trees, magic rings raise tables richly spread with food in lonely places, ships become goddesses, and men are changed into snakes or birds or bears. It is fun to read about. The least suspicion that it had really happened would turn that fun into nightmare. You find no miracles of that kind in the Gospels. Such things, if they could be, would prove that some alien power was invading nature. They would not in the least prove that it was the same power which had made nature and rules her every day. But the true miracles express not simply a God, but God, that which is outside nature not as a foreigner, but as her sovereign. They announce not merely that a king has visited our town, but that it is the king, our king. The second class of miracles, on this view, foretell what God has not yet done, but will do universally. He raised one man, the man who was himself, from the dead, because he will one day raise all men from the dead. Perhaps not only men, for there are hints in the New Testament that all creation will eventually be rescued from decay, restored to shape, and subserve the splendor of remade humanity. The Transfiguration, Matthew chapter 17 verses 1 to 9, Mark chapter 9 verses 2 to 10, and the walking on the water, Matthew chapter 14 verse 26, Mark chapter 6 verse 49, John chapter 6 verse 19, are glimpses of the beauty and the effortless power over all matter which will belong to men when they are really waked by God. Now, resurrection certainly involves reversal of natural process, in the sense that it involves a series of changes moving in the opposite direction to those we see. At death, matter which has been organic falls back gradually into the inorganic, to be finally scattered and used perhaps in other organisms. Resurrection would be the reverse process. It would not, of course, mean the restoration to each personality of those very atoms, numerically the same, which had made its first or natural body. There would not be enough to go round, for one thing, and for another, the unity of the body, even in this life, was consistent with a slow but perplexed change of its actual ingredients. But it certainly does mean matter of some kind rushing towards organism as we now see it rushing away. It means, in fact, playing backwards a film we have already seen played forwards. In that sense, it is reversal of nature. But, of course, it is a further question whether reversal in this sense is necessarily contradiction. Do we know that the film cannot be played backwards? Well, in one sense, it is precisely the teaching of modern physics that the film never works backwards. For modern physics, as you have heard before, the universe is running down. Disorganization and chance are continually increasing. There will come a time, not infinitely remote, when it will be wholly run down, or wholly disorganized, and science knows of no possible return from that state. There must have been a time, not infinitely remote, in the past, when it was wound up, though science knows of no winding-up process. The point is that for our ancestors the universe was a picture. For modern physics it is a story. If the universe is a picture, these things either appear in that picture or not, and if they don't, since it is an infinite picture, one may suspect that they are contrary to the nature of things. But a story is a different matter, especially if it is an incomplete story. And the story told by modern physics might be told briefly in the words, Humpty Dumpty was falling. That is, it proclaims itself an incomplete story. There must have been a time before he fell, when he was sitting on the wall. There must be a time after he has reached the ground. It is quite true that science knows of no horses and men who can put him together again once he has reached the ground and broken. But then, she also knows of no means by which he could originally have been put on the wall. You wouldn't expect her to. All science rests on observation. All our observations are taken during Humpty Dumpty's fall, because we were born after he lost his seat on the wall, and shall be extinct long before he reaches the ground. But to assume from observations taken while the clock is running down that the unimaginable winding up which must have preceded this process cannot occur when the process is over is the merest dogmatism. From the very nature of the case, the laws of degradation and disorganization which we find in matter at present cannot be the ultimate and eternal nature of things. If they were, there would have been nothing to degrade and disorganize. Humpty Dumpty can't fall off a wall that never existed. Obviously, an event which lies outside the falling or disintegrating process which we know as nature is not imaginable. If anything is clear from the records of our Lord's appearances after his resurrection, it is that the risen body was very different from the body that died, and that it lives under conditions quite unlike those of natural life. It is frequently not recognized by those who see it. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 31 and 36 to 37. John chapter 20, verses 14 to 16. And it is not related to space in the same way as our bodies. The sudden appearances and disappearances, Mark chapter 16, verse 14, Luke chapter 24, verses 31 and 36, John chapter 20, verses 19 and 26, suggest the ghost of popular tradition. Yet he emphatically insists that he is not merely a spirit, and takes steps to demonstrate that the risen body can still perform animal operations, such as eating. Luke chapter 24, verses 42 and 43, John chapter 21, verse 13. What makes all this baffling to us is our assumption that to pass beyond what we call nature, beyond the 3 dimensions and the 5 highly specialized and limited senses, is immediately to be in a world of pure negative spiritually, a world where space of any sort and sense of any sort have no function. I know no grounds for believing this. To explain even an atom, Schrödinger wants 7 dimensions, and give us new senses, and we should find a new nature. There may be natures piled upon natures, each supernatural to the one beneath it, before we come to the abyss of pure spirit. And to be in that abyss, at the right hand of the Father, may not mean being absent from any of these natures, may mean a yet more dynamic presence on all levels. That is why I think it very rash to assume that the story of the Ascension is mere allegory. I know it sounds like the work of people who imagined an absolute up and down and a local heaven in the sky. But to say this is, after all, to say, assuming that the story is fake, we could thus explain how it arose. Without that assumption, we find ourselves moving about in worlds unrealized, with no probability or improbability to guide us. For if the story is true, then a being still in some mode, though not our mode, corporeal, withdrew at his own will from the nature presented by our 3 dimensions and 5 senses, not necessarily into the non-sensuous and undimensioned, but possibly into or through a world or worlds of supersense and superspace. And he might choose to do it gradually. Who on earth knows what the spectators might see? If they say they saw a momentary movement along the vertical plane, then an indistinct mass, then nothing, who is to pronounce this improbable? My time is nearly up, and I must be very brief with the second class of people whom I promised to deal with. Those who mistake the laws of nature for laws of thought, and, therefore, think that any departure from them is a self-contradiction, like a square circle or 2 and 2 making 5. To think this is to imagine that the normal processes of nature are transparent to the intellect, that we can say why she behaves as she does. For, of course, if we cannot see why a thing is so, then we cannot see any reason why it should not be otherwise. But in fact, the actual course of nature is wholly inexplicable. I don't mean that science has not yet explained it, but may do some day. I mean that the very nature of explanation makes it impossible that we should even explain why matter has the properties it has. For explanation, by its very nature, deals with a world of ifs and ands. Every explanation takes the form, since A, therefore B, or if C, then D. In order to explain any event, you have to assume the universe as a going concern, a machine working in a particular way. Since this particular way of working is the basis of all explanation, it can never be itself explained. We can see no reason why it should not have worked a different way. To say this is not only to remove the suspicion that miracle is self-contradictory, but also to realize how deeply right St. Athanasius was when he found an essential likeness between the miracles of our Lord and the general order of nature. Both are a full stop for the explaining intellect. If the natural means that which can be fitted into a class, that which obeys a norm, that which can be paralleled, that which can be explained by reference to other events, then nature herself as a whole is not natural. If a miracle means that which must simply be accepted, the unanswerable actuality which gives no account of itself but simply is, then the universe is one great miracle. To direct us to that great miracle is one main object of the earthly acts of Christ. They are, as he himself said, signs. Matthew chapter 12 verse 39, chapter 16 verse 4, chapter 24 verses 24 and 30, Mark chapter 13 verse 22, chapter 16 verses 17 and 20, Luke chapter 21 verses 11 and 25. They serve to remind us that the explanations of particular events which we derived from the given, the unexplained, the almost willful character of the actual universe are not explanations of that character. These signs do not take us away from reality, they recall us to it, recall us from our dream world of ifs and ands to the stunning actuality of everything that is real. They are focal points at which more reality becomes visible than we ordinarily see at once. I have spoken of how he made miraculous bread and wine, and of how, when the Virgin conceived, he had shown himself the true genius whom men had ignorantly worshipped long before. It goes deeper than that. Bread and wine were to have an even more sacred significance for Christians, and the act of generation was to be the chosen symbol among all mystics for the union of the soul with God. These things are no accidents. With him there are no accidents. When he created the vegetable world, he knew already what dreams the annual death and resurrection of the corn would cause to stir in pious pagan minds. He knew already that he himself must so die and live again, and in what sense, including and far transcending the old religion of the Corn King. He would say, "This is my body," Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, Mark chapter 14, verse 22, Luke chapter 22, verse 19, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24. Common bread, miraculous bread, sacramental bread. These three are distinct, but not to be separated. Divine reality is like a fugue. All his acts are different, but they all rhyme or echo to one another. It is this that makes Christianity so difficult to talk about. Fix your mind on any one story or any one doctrine, and it becomes at once a magnet to which truth and glory come rushing from all levels of being. Our featureless pantheistic unities and glib rationalist distinctions are alike defeated by the seamless yet ever-varying texture of reality, the liveness, the elusiveness, the intertwined harmonies of the multidimensional fertility of God. But if this is the difficulty, it is also one of the firm grounds of our belief. To think that this was a fable, a product of our own brains as they are a product of matter, would be to believe that this vast symphonic splendor had come out of something much smaller and emptier than itself. It is not so. We are nearer to the truth in the vision seen by Julian of Norwich, when Christ appeared to her holding in his hand a little thing like a hazelnut, and saying, "This is all that is created." And it seemed to her so small and weak that she wondered how it could hold together at all. (17) Myth became fact. This essay first appeared in World Dominion, Volume 22, September-October 1944, and was reproduced in Undeceptions, 1971. It is now in God in the Dock, 1998. My friend Quirinius has advanced the charge that none of us are in fact Christians at all. According to him, historic Christianity is something so barbarous that no modern man can really believe it. The moderns who claim to do so are in fact believing a modern system of thought which retains the vocabulary of Christianity and exploits the emotions inherited from it while quietly dropping its essential doctrines. Quirinius compared modern Christianity with the modern English monarchy. The forms of kingship have been retained, but the reality has been abandoned. All this I believe to be false, except of a few modernist theologians who, by God's grace, become fewer every day. But for the moment, let us assume that Quirinius is right. Let us pretend, for purposes of argument, that all who now call themselves Christians have abandoned the historic doctrines. Let us suppose that modern Christianity reveals a system of names, rituals, formulae, and metaphors which persists although the thoughts behind it have changed. Quirinius ought to be able to explain the persistence. Why, on his view, do all these educated and enlightened pseudo-Christians insist on expressing their deepest thoughts in terms of an archaic mythology which must hamper and embarrass them at every turn? Why do they refuse to cut the umbilical cord which binds the living and flourishing child to its moribund mother? For if Quirinius is right, it should be a great relief to them to do so. Yet the odd thing is that even those who seem most embarrassed by the sediment of barbaric Christianity in their thought become suddenly obstinate when you ask them to get rid of it altogether. They will strain the cord almost to breaking point, but they refuse to cut it. Sometimes they will take every step except the last one. If all who professed Christianity were clergymen, it would be easy, though uncharitable, to reply that their livelihood depends on not taking that last step. Yet even if this were the true cause of their behaviour, even if all clergymen are intellectual prostitutes who preach for pay, and usually starvation pay, what they secretly believe to be false, surely so widespread a darkening of conscience among thousands of men not otherwise known to be criminal itself demands explanation. And, of course, the profession of Christianity is not confined to the clergy. It is professed by millions of lay men and women who earn thereby contempt, unpopularity, suspicion, and the hostility of their own families. How does this come to happen? Obstinacies of this sort are interesting. Why not cut the cord, asks Quirinius. Everything would be much easier if you would free your thought from this vestigial mythology. To be sure, far easier. Life would be far easier for the mother of an invalid child if she put it into an institution, and adopted someone else's healthy baby instead. Life would be far easier to many a man if he abandoned the woman he has actually fallen in love with and married someone else because she is more suitable. The only defect of the healthy baby and the suitable woman is that they leave out the patient's only reason for bothering about a child or wife at all. Would not conversation be much more rational than dancing? Said Jane Austen's Miss Bingley. Much more rational, replied Mr. Bingley, but much less like a ball. In the same way, it would be much more rational to abolish the English monarchy. But how if, by doing so, you leave out the one element in our state which matters most? How if the monarchy is the channel through which all the vital elements of citizenship, loyalty, the consecration of secular life, the hierarchical principle, splendour, ceremony, continuity, still trickle down to irrigate the dust bowl of modern economic statecraft? The real answer of even the most modernist Christianity to Quirinius is the same. Even assuming, which I most constantly deny, that the doctrines of historic Christianity are merely mythical, it is the myth which is the vital and nourishing element in the whole concern. Quirinius wants us to move with the times. Now, we know where times move. They move away. But in religion we find something that does not move away. It is what Quirinius calls the myth that abides. It is what he calls the modern and living thought that moves away. Not only the thought of theologians, but the thought of anti-theologians. Where are the predecessors of Quirinius? Where is the Epicureanism of Lucretius? The pagan revival of Julian the Apostate? Where are the Gnostics? Where is the monism of Averroes, the deism of Voltaire, the dogmatic materialism of the great Victorians? They have moved with the times. But the thing they were all attacking remains. Quirinius finds it still there to attack. The myth, to speak his language, has outlived the thoughts of all its defenders and all of its adversaries. It is the myth that gives life. Those elements even in modernist Christianity which Quirinius regards as vestigial are the substance. What he takes for the real modern belief is the shadow. To explain this, we must look a little closer at myth in general, and at this myth in particular. Human intellect is incurably abstract. Pure mathematics is the type of successful thought. Yet the only realities we experience are concrete, this pain, this pleasure, this dog, this man. While we are loving the man, bearing the pain, enjoying the pleasure, we are not intellectually apprehending pleasure, pain, or personality. When we begin to do so, on the other hand, the concrete realities sink to the level of mere instances or examples. We are no longer dealing with them, but with that which they exemplify. This is our dilemma, either to taste and not to know, or to know and not to taste. or more strictly, to lack one kind of knowledge because we are in an experience, or to lack another kind because we are outside it. As thinkers, we are cut off from what we think about. As tasting, touching, willing, loving, hating, we do not clearly understand. The more lucidly we think, the more we are cut off. The more deeply we enter into reality, the less we can think. You cannot study pleasure in the moment of the nuptial embrace, nor repentance while repenting, nor analyze the nature of humour while roaring with laughter. But when else can you really know these things? If only my toothache would stop, I could write another chapter about pain. But once it stops, what do I know about pain? Of this tragic dilemma, myth is the partial solution. In the enjoyment of a great myth, we come nearest to experiencing as a concrete what can otherwise be understood only as an abstraction. At this moment, for example, I am trying to understand something very abstract indeed, the fading, vanishing of tasted reality as we try to grasp it with the discursive reason. Probably I have made heavy weather of it. But if I remind you instead of Orpheus and Eurydice, how he was suffered to lead her by the hand, but, when he turned round to look at her, she disappeared. What was merely a principle becomes imaginable. You may reply that you never till this moment attached that meaning to that myth. Of course not. You are not looking for an abstract meaning at all. If that was what you were doing, the myth would be for you no true myth, but a mere allegory. You were not knowing, but tasting. But what you were tasting turns out to be a universal principle. The moment we state this principle, we are admittedly back in the world of abstraction. It is only while receiving the myth as a story that you experience the principle concretely. When we translate, we get abstraction, or rather dozens of abstractions. What flows into you from the myth is not truth, but reality. Truth is always about something, but reality is that about which truth is, and, therefore, every myth becomes the father of innumerable truths on the abstract level. Myth is the mountain whence all the different streams arise which become truths down here in the valley. In hac valle abstractionis. Or, if you prefer, myth is the isthmus which connects the peninsular world of thought with that vast continent we really belong to. It is not, like truth, abstract, nor is it, like direct experience, bound to the particular. Now, as myth transcends thought, incarnation transcends myth. The heart of Christianity is a myth which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be a myth, comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens, at a particular date, in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from a Balder or an Osiris, dying nobody knows when or where, to a historical person crucified, it is all in order, under Pontius Pilate. By becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth. That is the miracle. I suspect that men have sometimes derived more spiritual sustenance from myths they did not believe than from the religion they professed. To be truly Christian, we must both assent to the historical fact and also receive the myth, a fact though it has become, with the same imaginative embrace which we accord to all myths. The one is hardly more necessary than the other. A man who disbelieved the Christian story as fact, but continually fed on it as myth, would, perhaps, be more spiritually alive than one who assented and did not think much about it. The modernist, the extreme modernist, infidel in all but name, need not be called a fool or hypocrite because he obstinately retains, even in the midst of his intellectual atheism, the language, rites, sacraments, and story of the Christians. The poor man may be clinging, with a wisdom he himself by no means understands, to that which is his life. It would have been better that Loisy should have remained a Christian. It would not necessarily have been better that he should have purged his thought of vestigial Christianity. Those who do not know that this great myth became fact when the Virgin conceived are, indeed, to be pitied. But Christians also need to be reminded, we may thank Quirinius for reminding us, that what became fact was a myth, that it carries with it into the world of fact all the properties of a myth. God is more than a god, not less. Christ is more than Balder, not less. We must not be ashamed of the mythical radiance resting on our theology. We must not be nervous about parallels and pagan Christs. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. We must not, in false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome. If God chooses to be mythopoeic, and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse to be mythopathic? For this is the marriage of heaven and earth, perfect myth and perfect fact, claiming not only our love and our obedience, but also our wonder and delight, addressed to the savage, the child, and the poet in each one of us, no less than to the moralist, the scholar, and the philosopher.